Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of The Other Reading. This Sunday is Pentecost, which means we have lots of options available to us from the lectionary. Those options are, the first reading can be either an Old Testament reading, Numbers 11, reading from verses 24 to 30, which does provide some Old Testament background to the other readings, or the reading from Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 21. The psalm for the day is Psalm 104, 24 to 35, which is all about the Holy Spirit's role in creating and then sustaining the creation and renewing the creation. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 3b to 13 is the epistle reading, and that's the reading I'm actually going to be preaching on this Sunday. Alternatively, instead of the epistle reading, we could have Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 21 at that point in the service. Finally, we have a choice of gospel readings, both from John's Gospel, John 20, verses 19 to 23, when Jesus breathed the Holy Spirit upon the gathered disciples, the resurrected Christ. We had that reading just the other week. Or John chapter 7, verses 37 to 39. As I said, I'll be preaching this week on the reading from 1 Corinthians, and the other reading is the reading that I think I've preached on every other Pentecost Sunday since my ordination, and that's the reading from Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 21. Let's hear that reading. This is a reading that Bible readers who are rostered for Pentecost Sunday fear, because of the long list of nations and nationalities that hear their own language. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages, as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. "Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. All your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above, and signs on the earth below. Blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So, what background do we need to know to understand this text? Well, the first is this. The word Pentecost simply means 50 days. Pentecost was a Jewish festival celebrating the giving of the law, and it was held 50 days after the Passover. Easter, of course, the first Easter, coincided with the Passover, so for Christians, Pentecost is celebrated 50 days after Easter. The word simply means 50 days. The Christians, we've been told, had been waiting, just as Jesus had told them to. He had told them to wait and to pray, and so that is what they were doing. And on this particular day, there were 120 of them gathered in one place. When the Spirit came, there was a great wind. Now, the Greek word for wind is pneuma, and that word can also be translated as breath or as spirit. In the same way, the Hebrew word ruach can be translated as wind or breath or spirit. And there's a lot of playing upon those words in all the texts this morning. There's a great pneuma, a great wind. There are these tongues of fire, or something like tongues of fire. This is one of those stories where Luke, who is a consummate storyteller, struggles to find the words to describe something that had never happened before. A truly unique event. With what could one compare this? There was nothing like it. After the tongues of fire had kind of settled on top of each of them, they all started to speak. They spoke in languages other than their own, and this drew a large crowd who were amazed. Apparently, among the crowd were Jews and converts to Judaism from the Jewish diaspora, from Jewish communities from all over the world, who spoke the languages of the country from which they came. They had come to Jerusalem to celebrate the great festivals of Passover and Pentecost. They hear the disciples speaking, telling of the great deeds of God, which presumably were the deeds associated with Jesus, his death and resurrection, in their own language, and they are amazed. Some are scornful, however. They're just drunk, they say. Peter gets up and preaches a sermon of which we only hear the first part on Pentecost Sunday, that part where Peter shows how the events that are taking place are in fulfillment of the prophecies of the prophet Joel. Okay, so what would I preach on were I to preach on the other reading for this Sunday? Well, maybe I would compare and contrast the giving of the law on one hand, the original celebration of Pentecost, and the giving of the Spirit on the other. And I think that there's some comparisons and contrasts to be made. Or more likely, I would consider how each person who gathers to hear the disciples hears the gospel proclaimed in their own language. There's not one new language that the disciples speak and the crowd understands. No. Everybody hears the mighty deeds of God being proclaimed in their own language. Linguistic and cultural differences are not abolished. And then I would go on to talk about how the Christian church embraces diversity. That there is room within the Christian community for people of every culture, people who speak every language. More importantly, I would discuss how the gospel is good news for all people. It's a message not just for some, but for everyone, regardless of nationality or culture. The gospel is at once inclusive whilst allowing for diversity. And this is very important. Or most likely, I would look at how the events of Pentecost that Luke describes are events that follow both a command and a promise that the risen Christ had given before his ascension, and see how the fulfillment of that promise made obedience to the command possible. The coming of this promised Spirit empowers the church to fulfill Jesus' commandment to go out into the world and to bear witness to him. The book of Acts describes the beginnings of that mission, a mission which continues to this day. Yes, we refer to the book of Acts, its full name, as the Acts of the Apostles, and it certainly describes the Acts of the Apostles, most especially Peter in the first half of the book of Acts, and Paul and his colleagues in the second half. But really, the book of Acts describes the acts of the Holy Spirit working through the apostles. The book of Acts is all about the Holy Spirit. And it shows the way in which the Holy Spirit always points towards Christ. One theologian has described the Holy Spirit as the shy member of the Trinity, always pointing away from herself towards Christ. Regardless of what I chose to speak about during the body of the sermon, I'm sure that I would end it by asking, how do we see the Holy Spirit active among us? How do we see the Holy Spirit acting through us? Where in our life is the Holy Spirit working through us to bear witness to Christ and to the great things God has done in and through Christ? I would remind us that the mission of the church is ultimately God's mission. It's what God does through us, not what we choose to do ourselves. Ultimately, it doesn't depend on us. It is Christ who, through the work of his Holy Spirit, who builds the church. Our denominations, our church structures and so on are all human constructs. But the church, the body of believers, the body of disciples, the followers of Jesus, regardless of which denomination they belong to, are the creation of the Holy Spirit. And our mission is to be channels of the Spirit's work in the world. However, this Pentecost, I'll be preaching on 1 Corinthians. So this reading from Acts, well, it's the other reading. Hopefully I'll see you all on Sunday, or at least you'll see me. Worship will again be live streamed on Facebook at 9:30 a.m. and a recording of the sermon will be put up on the website very soon afterwards. God bless and have a wonderful Pentecost.